Chapter 2. Sue was looking through the newspaper. She had gotten the paper every morning at the convenience store up the road, ever since she had gotten back to her humble abode. She was up at that hour anyway. She was barely sleeping anymore. It was getting easier to read each day, since the tears were not welling up in her eyes quite as often. She was just left with a deep, dark depression, a sense of doom and dread. She would give up her search after it had been a week. It had already been 5 days since it had happened. Michelle had been dead and spent 2 nights and a day in the county morgue before Sue had even known. She had been doing all she could to cope in the past 3 days. She felt overwhelming guilt about not having been there. She wondered what she could have done. She played a fantasy over and over in her head. She knew she could not have left a note. The killer would have simply taken it down. She knew that even the two of them had no shot at overpowering an experienced murderer. What she was doing in her head was waiting patiently on the front steps of the building across the street. She remained unnoticed there. She never got up to pee or for anything at all. She saw Michelle from behind start to enter the building at some arbitrary point that night. The image of her was blurry. It was already hard to remember her in motion and in person. Sue had a few photographs, but they didn't do her justice. She grabbed Michelle by the shoulder and turned her around. They made up instantly right there on the spot where they stood on the sidewalk. They even engaged in an embrace in public. Sue warned her of the impending danger of the killer. She never pictured him going into the building. She didn't really care about that. He was the menace, but he was not the point. The point was just to snatch up Michelle from peril and run away with her and be with her forever. Despite her feeling of anonymity, a part of her thought that she might be spotted just the same. Maybe the killer had seen her through Rob's psychic flashes or whatever they were. She tried to relieve her guilt by acknowledging the fact that there was no way she could have known, and if she had been there in ignorance with Michelle, there would have been nothing that she could do except die along beside her. Maybe that would have been better, the way she felt. She felt like her heart was literally breaking in her chest. It was cracking slowly but surely, and soon it would shatter into a million pieces. Maybe it would feel better after that. She was just idly turning the inky pages. She skimmed the funnies and ignored the upsetting headlines. None of them pertained to her. Michelle's death hadn't made the front page. Sue had gotten the first paper the 3rd day after it had happened, and there had been no mention. It was big stuff, and not just to her. That guy was all over the news on a nationwide scale. Why wasn't it in the paper? It probably had been in the next day's edition, but it had come and it had gone, like so many stories that had come and gone after it. Every single person in the overpopulated city had a story to tell, and they were burying each other's getting them out there. It was still unbelievable that there was nothing related to what had happened at all. The guy was still at large. Maybe it was too important, and the police were suppressing information to get a proper lead on him. She hoped they got his ass soon and gunned him down where they found him. He surely would not go quietly, but bullets would not do that much good, according to what Rob had told her. She was grateful to Officer Dover for letting her know what had happened. She hated originally hearing it from that batty bitch across the hall. Sue had never been the type to shoot the messenger, but in Mrs. Cranston's case, she would have been all too happy, if only she had a firearm. That old cunt told her so bluntly, while feigning sympathy. She acted like Sue needed to make her feel better. She wanted Sue to reassure her that she did not know the attacker and tell her that he would not be back and that it was definitely not Rob who had done it at all. Sue was expected to show remorse for the building manager who had apparently been murdered so the killer could sneak into her apartment. She had just been stunned. She hadn't truly believed what she had heard. Mrs. Cranston wasn't the most stable type, but that seemed like a stretch even for her. Officer Dover had confirmed that the worst had happened. That had been when it was real for sure, but it was starting to not feel that way again. Reality felt fragile and like it was coming and going in ebbs and flows. Michelle might still come in at any moment wondering why Sue was so glum. It had all been a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. Officer Dover asked if there was any reason or connection between the murderer and the victims that she knew of. She simply said no. He said Michelle was being autopsied, despite her parents' protests, for evidence. He said her folks had identified her body, and that he was very sorry for her loss. She believed him. She felt his sorrow through the phone line. That was when it had struck her and brought her to her knees, sobbing hysterically, while Officer Dover offered for her to call back if he could help in any way, or if she got any new information. He politely hung up since she was not in the position to disconnect her end. and he left her with her grief. One of the few times she had stopped sobbing hard enough to breathe, and after she had taken in the damages around the apartment that looked much worse than they were, she found Michelle's apology in a plastic bag on the dining table. That had broken her down all over again, and at one strange point had even made her laugh. Michelle had gotten the last word, even in death. Sue had put a pretty sizable dent in the tequila. It was a lot for her, but in her grief-stricken condition she barely felt it. She was going through a literal sobering experience that was rendering her incapable of getting fucked up. How much worse could she make her body feel than it already did? It had been unbearable, but just as she started to feel like she could function like a normal human being, she was also just starting to have a chance to really miss Michelle. Michelle was not just away on some vacation. She was gone forever and was never coming back, and that really was going to be the way she would live from then on. Her heart would ache for the rest of her life until she expired from the exhaustive sadness. On the second-to-last page was the section she had gotten the paper for, the obituaries. She had been so afraid that she had missed it. What if it had been printed the very next day, before she even had a chance to find out what had happened? She tried to get copies from the couple of days that she was missing, but she couldn't find anyone accessible who had them. She was not going to go all the way down to the library on the bus in her state. She would spare the public her presence until she was better fit to deal with it. That meant even work would have to wait. There was no choice about that. She had continued her search anyway, and there it was at last. There was her name at last. Michelle J. Hart. Her parents' home address was listed as her place of residence. There was her date of birth, and it said she was murdered sometime in the evening, and then listed her date of death. It said she was an excellent student at Los Angeles City College, and that she was studying to be a computer technician. She was survived by her loving parents, Veronica and Charles Hart. Services would be on Monday at noon at the Hollywood Forever Chapel. Burial would be at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. There would be no visitation at the burial. Sue was no longer just depressed. She was furious. She wadded up the paper and threw it across the room after it had blackened her hands. "Those motherfuckers!" she screamed aloud. Michelle was certainly not living with her asshole parents anymore. She was not trying to become a computer technician. She was studying for graphic design work, but she wanted to pursue research. She wanted to be cremated, not buried. Sue couldn't believe they got her birthday right for as well as they knew her. They didn't deserve to know her. Sue was glad they didn't get to. It was their loss, and it was a huge one. She had at first felt a bit foolish for not calling Michelle's parents to find out what was going on, and to offer that they could have any of Michelle's things that they wanted. Her gut hadn't let her go so far as to even pick up the phone. She was glad she had listened to it after all. They obviously weren't any the wiser from the experience of losing their daughter. Did they even care? Why hadn't they called her to find out what Michelle's last days had been like? Surely they had fought, but it had been one of those overly heated arguments that you know will be over the next time you see each other. Sue just never got her next time to give her apology, and it wasn't fair. They had been great together. Why did their last time one-on-one have to be that way? She hoped Michelle hadn't suffered. She really did, but it hurt too much to stay on that thought. Were her shitty parents going through even a fraction of what she was feeling? Couldn't they commiserate and understand each other's pain, if not bond over it? Michelle had been right about them. They knew she hated them, and Sue knew she loved her. That was all that mattered. It wasn't quite enough, however. Not really. She would go to the service all right. The only real question was, what to wear.